tulips of the Netherlands are a far cry from where tulips originated and where they still continue to thrive in their natural habitat. I have never been to the steppes of Asia, but I have indeed been to Istanbul in the year 2000, as well as the Netherlands in 2012. So with the exceptions of the countries in Central Asia, I have been to the gardens that we are going to visit. I like to think of these tours as little trips that we can take in the comfort of our own homes. Since lockdown, now heading towards our 6th month, we have all had to cancel trips and learn to travel vicariously over the internet. I have the usual disclaimer, which is that the history of the tulip is such a vast topic that I have really only scratched the surface. So with apologies to those who are scholars of history, particularly of the Ottoman Empire, I can only hope that this will be an entertaining introduction to the subject. You, my audience, have given me a splendid purpose during these very strange times of lockdown in the preparation and the presentation of these 4 garden tours. I have really loved doing the research with your enthusiasm as my motivation. I really cannot thank you enough. So we are now going to visit some very far away places. We are going back in time, and we are going to learn that the tulip has traveled more widely and been held in the highest esteem more than we ever imagined. So let us begin our journey.
What's that here? Share.
Okay, all set?
Yeah.
When we think of tulips, we think of Holland, which is where most of the world's tulip bulbs come from. It's hard to realize that this is a commercial crop, and certainly Holland's most successful export. Okay, Jeff.
Yeah.
Hold on. The next slide is not coming up.
Slight technical hitch here.
So I can't see my
I can't see either.
I can't see myself. Sorry, everybody. We're just taking a little pause here. I need to see the.
It's not working for some reason.
Back to meeting. Okay. Share full screen.
This is it, yeah. Hi, Amanda, can you hear us?
Amanda, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
Could you hear Margaret's beginning of the presentation?
Perfectly, yes. She stopped it where it's a commercial export for Holland.
Okay, our slides are not.
They're not sliding.
They're not sliding. Yes.
Let's see. You
So,
might have to close.
okay, here we go.
Oh,
All right.
perfect.
All right. So this should be slide 2. The Dutch mastery of cultivating, growing, and selling tulips is a phenomenon in and of itself. They have had a healthy bulb export business since the middle of the 17th century, and from around 1860 onwards, the Dutch, always in tune with their time, kept their marketing current. Shipments of bulk bulbs were sent to nurseries across the oceans, particularly to the growing market in the United States. The Netherlands is the world's main producer of commercial tulip plants, producing 4.3 billion tulip bulbs each year, some 53% of which, 2.3 billion, are made into cut flowers. The Dutch were the first to publish their catalogs in the language of the country receiving them, creating even greater interest and demand, coupled with a knowledgeable sales force, cheap prices, reasonable payment plans, reliable delivery, and free demonstration gardens, it is easy to see how they captured the trade. You can see the bulb fields in bloom from the air in April and May when you fly into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. They resemble brightly colored ribbons and contain literally millions and millions of bulbs. But by far the best way to see and experience the bulb fields is on a bike, something else the Dutch have millions of. Tulips are perennials, so the bulbs will grow and flower year after year. They grow best in maritime areas, preferably not further away than 50 to 75 kilometers or 30 to 50 miles from the coast. In the Netherlands, the area most like this is near the coast of the North Sea. And the best type of soil is a sandy clay. Tulips are classified as perfect and complete flowers, which of course they are, which means the tulip structure contains both male and female parts. Each blossom contains 6 male reproductive organs called stamens. This picture shows you clearly the male and female parts, and it takes about 5 to 7 years for a seed to mature and then produce a flower. The Dutch have even figured out how to produce a flower every 8 months rather than 12. So they shortened the commercial time, which is incredibly clever. With 75 wild tulip species and over 150 different species altogether, it's not surprising that there are over 3,000 different varieties of tulip. However, there is still no blue tulip. Tulips are geophytes, plants with leaves that die back annually to an underground bulb, corm, tuber, or rhizome. Winter rains instigate root growth. Spring rains enables the sprouting and growing of foliage, stem and flower, and as the flower and leaves die, nutrients return underground. With sufficient moisture and nutrients, the bulb and next year's flower will regrow and wait underground. A period of cold, coupled and followed by moisture, trigger the new year's growth. Tulips need a temperature of not more than 9 degrees Celsius or 48 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 3 months in order to fully convert the starch in the bulbs into sugars for energy, which is why we cannot grow tulips successfully in Cape Town because we don't have enough cold weather. Another interesting fact about tulips is that they are edible. Coming from the Liliaceae family alongside lilies, onion, garlic, and asparagus, tulips could be used as a replacement for onions in many dishes. During the Second World War, the bulb industry had to grapple with a number of setbacks, obviously, as many industries did. The Dutch continued to use tulips as a commodity when the opportunity arose. For instance, at the onset of World War II, 4 million tulip bulbs were sent to the US in exchange for arms. And during periods of starvation in the Netherlands during the war, the Dutch resorted to eating tulips to survive. If Holland is famous for its hybrid tulips, it is Central Asia that is the epicenter of wild tulips. Tulips are familiar to millions worldwide, but very few people have had the opportunity to see them growing in their original natural habitat. So let me take you to where tulips grow wild, in the largest Eurasian country of their origin. Welcome to Kazakhstan. Tulips are native to some of the most remote places on Earth, hard to reach mountain ridges and barren slopes. If you really wanted to see tulips in the wild, you would need to be able to ride a horse. Wild tulips, the forebears of the hybridized versions we see today, still grow throughout Central Asia. Now let's just remind ourselves of exactly where Kazakhstan is. Did you know that Kazakhstan is the world's largest landlocked country at 725,000 square kilometers, and that is larger than all of Western Europe. Among interesting facts about Kazakhstan is that its national drink is fermented horse milk. Yum, delicious. In addition to the tulip, it is believed that the humble apple also originated in Kazakhstan. I think most of us only heard of Kazakhstan when the British filmmaker and actor Sacha Baron Cohen made his infamous comedy movie called Borat, which parodied a Kazakh journalist who takes a trip to America. This is what wild tulips look like blooming in Kazakhstan. So the spread of the tulip was gradually westward, from the eastern steppes of Eurasia, following the Silk Road. Eventually, Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the city of tulips and a center for distributing the bulbs. But before we head to Turkey to learn how the Ottoman Empire embraced the tulip, we're going to look at what tulips in the wild look like. Here's another picture of Kazakhstan, but in reality, the range of the wild tulip is quite broad, covering countries like Iran, Crete, Italy, and Cyprus, and virtually all of the stands. The tulip is very adaptable and can survive extremes of climate, altitude, and wind. Nearly all of them grow in climates with winter and spring rainfall and dry, baking summers, and in slightly alkaline soil. These beautiful yellow tulips are seen at 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet in southeastern Kazakhstan. These particular bulbs have a very hard skin that is lined with wool-like fur, which may help to protect the bulb from freezing in winter. This is apparently one of the strangest and rarest of all wild tulips, mainly because of its ribbed leaves, which may be an adaptation to the tough growing conditions in the Chuli Mountains, which are at 800 meters or 2,600 feet in Kazakhstan. And it can be searingly hot by day and freezing at night. Look at the schist or metamorphic rock that is split into layers, making the ground extremely tough and rocky. A tulip that grows and blooms happily in rock crevices or in ground like this on the side of a cold, dry mountain may languish in a garden soil in a more temperate climate. Ironic as it may seem, many of these rugged beauties are easily killed with kindness. These oddball tulips are like the missing link between tulips and fritillarias, or other members of the lily family. And this tulip can be found at 2,800 meters or 9,200 feet in alpine meadows above Almaty, the former capital of Kazakhstan. In this area of Kazakhstan, which borders Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, this pretty tulip begins to bloom soon after the snow melts. At higher elevations, up to 5,000 meters or 16,400 feet, plants can sometimes be found blooming into August. Wild boar love to eat the bulbs of this tulip, which are high in starch. You would have to be really fit, dedicated, and obsessed by tulips to climb to some of these elevations so far off the beaten track to see them. The red flowers of this tulip shown here growing at 1,300 meters or 4,300 feet in southern Kazakhstan are the size of your fist. Locals often sell the flowers along the sides of roads that may once have been part of the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected Europe and the Far East for hundreds of years. Isn't that just gorgeous? These tulips exhibit one of the most intense orange-red colors to be found anywhere. The flowers glow like beacons in the Gisar Mountains of Tajikistan, and they're at about 2,300 meters or 7,500 feet. A few Dutch growers have this species in their fields. It is extremely pretty, but the bulbs are so tough that apparently it hurts your hands to clean them. This very early tulip is from the mountains of northwestern Iran. As soon as the snow melts, the fragrant flowers begin to emerge. Early flying bumblebees rely on their nectar to survive early spring in this rugged area. Now, normally tulips don't have very much of a fragrance. You don't grow them for fragrance, that's for sure. So the person who develops a wonderful smelling blue tulip will become a very wealthy gardener indeed. This tulip makes its home on the north-facing cliffs in the mountains of Western Crete, where not even goats can find a footing. The bulbs make runners that allow them to take up residence in new cracks in the rock face. Now, these runners are called stolons, S-T-O-L-O-N-S. I've never even heard of that word. Had to look it up. Tulips multiply by either seed, offsets, or stolons. And it takes up to 7 years to produce a mature plant that flowers from seed, whereas offsets or little bulblets will generally produce a flower in 1 to 2 years. Certain tulip species are stoloniferous and are referred to as good naturalizers. And these beauties are from an Italian nature reserve in Umbria, and they have the very pointy shape that the Ottomans prized. Obviously, the tulip likes hot, dry summers and cold winters, which explains why so few of my replanted tulips came up every year in the United Kingdom. Alas, England was too wet, and probably many of my bulbs rotted. The tulip was apparently pretty good at spreading itself. These yellow tulips were originally native to Italy, but they made their way via old trading routes to other parts of Western Europe. In Germany, this yellow beauty grows on the steep slopes of vineyards, and in Norway, it can be found near seaports. Ships in centuries past carried soil as ballast. At the end of a voyage, the soil was often dumped near the port, and sometimes there was buried treasure in the soil, as in bulbs. Now, how often in our own gardens do we see something coming up and we have just no idea how it got there? And these tulips are from Crete. Again, such a barren landscape, high, dry, and windy, and cold in the winter. So when did the tulip begin to migrate west? It moved from Central Asia through Iran and settled down in Anatolia, from where it scattered all across Europe. During its long journey, it managed to adapt to every condition, offering beauty, color, and durability in some of nature's harshest conditions. Long before the Dutch began breeding the flower as the buxom blossoms we know today, the tulip was a tiny gem-like bloom that filled the gardens of the Ottoman Empire, its likeness woven into rugs and fired into ceramics. The tulip first appeared in nomadic art when the Seljuk tribes arrived in Turkey at the end of the 11th century, 1,000 years ago, and seized Anatolia from the Byzantines. Anatolia roughly corresponds to the Asian part of Turkey today. The Seljuks were originally Turkic nomads who inhabited the steppes of Central Asia and Southeast Russia. The first true tulip fanatics were the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, which at its zenith in the 16th and 17th centuries stretched from Morocco to the Caspian Sea and from Yemen to Hungary. In their lavish palaces in Constantinople, the sultans collected and displayed the riches of their empire and treasures secured through trade. Tulips were among these treasures, and they were bred extensively and planted in large numbers in the palace gardens. Sultan Mehmed II, often called Mehmed the Conqueror, at the age of 21, conquered Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, in 1453, and he brought an end to the Byzantine Empire, essentially Christians. After the fall of Constantinople, one of the first things the Ottomans did was to plant gardens in the many empty spaces that existed. With splendid views of the Bosphorus, they planted lush pleasure gardens, terraced with vines, fruit trees, and flowers. Constantinople of the Ottoman Empire became a city of religious tolerance, which was unheard of in Europe. It was known for its good manners, good taste, and coffee houses. It was a city of culture, at the center of which was the abode of bliss, better known as the Topkapi Palace. Mehmed II was clearly a fan of horticulture. Following the conquest of the city, he began building the Topkapi Palace, which was decorated with thousands of tiles featuring a profusion of tulip motifs. He planned pleasure gardens around the palace with streams and fountains, pavilions linked by rows of poplars, and of course, masses of flowers. It is said that he had so many flowers in his 12 gardens that he required a staff of 920 gardeners. He lived there until his death in 1481. As a passionate gardener, Mehmed collected rare plants from throughout the provinces. Unfortunately, he had another side to his horticultural passion. One day he discovered that one of his prized cucumbers had been stolen, and he had the palace gardeners brought before him and disemboweled one by one in the hope of ascertaining which one of them had eaten the cucumber. This contrast between cruelty and beauty, in this case, an enthusiasm for exquisite palaces and gardens, is intriguing, especially considering the fact that the palace gardeners sometimes had to double up as executioners themselves. By the 16th century, the area of present-day Kazakhstan and surrounding countries had been conquered by Suleiman I and came under the influence of the Ottoman Empire. The tulip, recognized as a special and unique flower, was taken along to Turkey, where it was introduced to the gardens of the richest dignitaries. Now, Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent, was Mehmed's great-grandson. And under Suleiman the Magnificent, 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the tulip reached new heights. He reigned from 1494 until 1556, ruling over 25 million people, and he presided not only over an expansion in Ottoman territory, but also a golden age of artistic production. From the workshops associated with the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a range of robes, manuscripts, textiles, and luxury objects were being made that drew on a shared range of artistic motifs, one of which was obviously the tulip. It was under Suleiman the Magnificent that the tulip began to be cultivated. And here is another picture of Suleiman with his tulip-like turban. The name tulip is thought to be derived from a Persian word for turban, which it may have been thought to resemble. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan's court painter stylized the tulip in an elongated form with scimitar-like petals, and the resulting design helped to create an Ottoman brand. Suleiman had been unhappy with the Turkish elite's penchant for Italian silks and Italian treasures, but soon the shy tulip decorated everything from robes to buildings. Especially tiles, which if you have been to the Topkapi Palace, you know are simply remarkable, and there are tulip motifs everywhere. Mainly the long pointy tulips appear in red, and it was under Suleiman the Magnificent that as many as 2,000 new varieties of tulip were created in its Ottoman heyday. This is a picture of a tile taken from the harem of the Topkapi Palace with a tulip motif. The harem, or forbidden place, was the home of the Sultan and his women, and no unrelated male was allowed inside unless he was a eunuch. The eunuchs, who were apparently black, acted as gatekeepers and guardians for the women of the harem. Although the eunuchs were slaves, their position sometimes enabled them to gain considerable power and influence. Today, the Topkapi Palace is a museum, but it was the primary residence of the Ottoman sultans for about 400 years. And yes, tulips are still grown there today. When I went to visit the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul in June of 2000, obviously the tulips were over. But one of the most enduring things I remember is this tree. Now, this doesn't look like much, I know. And I had trouble even finding this photo, thanks to Mr. Google. But this is a fig tree growing as an epiphyte on a Mediterranean cypress. And the guides all point this out on the tour of the Topkapi. Now, just to refresh our science, a ficus is a deciduous tree, which means it sheds its leaves in a cold climate. And a cypress is a conifer, so it's evergreen. Now, an epiphyte is a plant that grows on another one, but is not a parasite. So these two very different trees were wrapped around each other like forbidden lovers. This made a huge impression on me 20 years ago. Now, let's get back to tulips. Tulips, especially those with the needle-like petals, were greatly prized by the sultans. Now, this spidery tulip can't be found in the wild and is likely a relic of the Ottoman Empire. Today, this tulip can be seen in horticultural museums, such as the Hortus Bulbarum in the Netherlands, and in the collections of tulip connoisseurs. So how did the tulips escape from the Ottoman Empire and find their way to the Netherlands? Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent gave some tulips to a man called Ogier Gisland de Berbeck, the Viennese ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. So he was Suleiman's ambassador from Vienna. He was a 16th century Flemish writer, herbalist, and diplomat in the employ of 3 generations of Austrian monarchs. He also wrote in enormous detail about the plant and animal life he encountered in Turkey. Back in Austria, de Busbeck then gave his friend Charles de l'Écluse some tulip bulbs. Charles, who was born in 1526 in France, was a humanist, a physician, and a botanist who managed the gardens of the Emperor of Austria. In 1593, Charles de l'Écluse became a professor at Leiden University and the head of the botanical garden in Leiden. In his botanical garden, the first tulips were planted in 1593. The tulips were pretty scarce and therefore very expensive. When Charles wrote the first major book on tulips in 1592, they became so popular that his garden was raided and bulbs stolen on a regular basis. But this then was the start of the bulb fields in the Netherlands that can be seen today. In the beginning of the 17th century, the tulip was starting to be used as a garden decoration in the Netherlands, and it soon gained major popularity as a trading product, especially in Holland. The interest for the flowers was huge, and bulbs were sold for unbelievably high prices. Botanists started to hybridize the flower, and they soon found ways of making even more decorative and tempting specimens. Hybrids and mutations of the flower were seen as rarities and a sign of high status. From 1636 to early 1637, there was a complete maniacal craze referred to as tulip mania in the Netherlands. Some bulbs could cost more than a house in Amsterdam at this time. Now, this is the bulb at the heart of tulip mania, the Semper Augustus, and it was among the rarest and most valuable because the bulbs produced broken flowers instead of being one solid hue. The petals had streaks of color running across paler backgrounds. Of these, the Semper Augustus became the most famous, in part because it was the most scarce. At one point, only 12 bulbs of the flower were said to exist. Few people had ever actually seen a Semper Augustus. The man who held a near monopoly on the small supply, and not everybody agrees on this, refused to sell his bulbs, which drove up the price. In 1638, one was advertised for 13,000 florins, the price of a nice house. In the 17th century, nobody knew what made a tulip break or break out in all these different lovely colors. Trying to cultivate a broken tulip was like trying to win the lottery, a game of chance soaked in ritual. Growers believed that if they fertilized their field with pigeon dung or plaster from old walls, they might produce a break. Others took a more direct approach by sprinkling the soil with their preferred pigments, or by tying a bulb that had produced a red flower to one that had grown a white flower. Alas, none of those things worked. Tulip mania has long been a source of wonder for historians and laymen alike. Stories have been circulating for nearly 400 years about the apparently strange compulsion, which I completely understand, that led otherwise sensible merchants, nobles, and artisan weavers to spend all they had and more on tulips, only to land in bankruptcy and ruin when the bottom fell out of the market in February of 1637. In fact, the stories about tulip mania are actually wildly exaggerated. It all started with this man, Charles Mackay, who was a Scottish poet, journalist, author, anthologist, and novelist, remembered for his book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. First published in 1841, it is often cited as the best book ever written about market psychology. In his book, he details 3 infamous financial manias, one of which was tulip mania. Mackay's account of inexplicable mania was unchallenged and mostly unexamined until the 1980s. Research into tulip mania since then suggests that his story was incomplete and inaccurate. In her 2007 scholarly analysis, Tulip Mania, Professor Anne Goldar of King's College states that the phenomenon was limited to a fairly small group, and that most accounts from the period are based on 1 or 2 contemporary pieces of propaganda and a prodigious amount of plagiarism. So according to Professor Goldar, no one drowned themselves in canals, and not a single bankrupt was found in these years who could be identified as someone dealt the fatal financial blow by tulip mania. Still, it is a wonderful story. In the 20th century, it was discovered that the frilly petals and dramatic flames that gave some varieties their stunning broken look were in fact the symptoms of an infection by the mosaic virus, which came to the tulip from a louse living on peaches and potatoes. These diseased varieties are, of course, no longer sold, obviously. But there are now hybrids that look similar but are genetically stable. Apparently, the mosaic virus would ultimately weaken the tulip so that it would die. However, the story of tulip mania persists, and anyone who finds tulips addictive, as I have, can understand how this craziness might have occurred, especially over the beautiful broken tulips. Tulip mania is often cited as the classic example of a financial bubble, one we now know was exaggerated, when the price of something goes up and up and up, not because of its intrinsic value, but because people who buy it expect to be able to sell it again at a profit. So we are going to leave the sultans, the manias, the high steppes of Kazakhstan, and take a look at the tulip industry today. Usually the period from March through May is the Dutch flower industry's strongest season. It pulls in 7 billion euros, that's $7.6 billion, with an average of $30 million in flowers sold daily. Tulip growers put their wares up for sale starting in March, when the flowers begin to bloom, and the season usually lasts about 8 weeks. However, this year has been very different. For tulip growers in the Netherlands, this spring was a true horror show as the market stalled because of the coronavirus, and tulips were unable to be sold. About 400 million flowers, including 140 million tulip stems, were destroyed in March and April of this year. Arguably, the largest and most spectacular spring garden is Keukenhof, located in Lisse, Holland, close to Amsterdam. But this year, because of Holland's anti-coronavirus measures, the park was shut down from its scheduled opening day, March 21st, until its scheduled closing date, May 10th. This will have cost Keukenhof an estimated $25 million in losses. Everywhere you look at Keukenhof, there are oceans, rivers, swaths of blooms. Just keep in mind, 7 million bulbs are planted every year. Here I am at Keukenhof in May of 2012, looking a little chubby, I have to say. But what is memorable to me about this picture is the depth of color that literally almost hurts your eyes. The muscari, or grape hyacinth, were mass planted for the greatest effect, and their color was absolutely stunning. In addition to the swaths of color, one of the things they do so well at Keukenhof is planting combinations of flowers. Here are daffodils amongst the tulips, and the Dutch are very clever at making everything bloom at the same time, since normally most daffodils bloom before tulips. I can tell you I was in sheer heaven. And here's a combination with 4 kinds of tulip and yellow fritillaria, sometimes known as the Persian lily. It may be that Keukenhof uses what is known as bulb lasagna gardening, also called double-deck bulb planting. This is particularly useful for pots, which refers to the placement of bulbs in the ground, some bulbs being planted more deeply than others. Lasagna gardening. Here is a mix of tulips and bleeding heart, one of my most favorite and old-fashioned perennial. One thing that we didn't realize when we visited Keukenhof was that it's one place in Holland where you cannot ride a bike. So you must be prepared to walk a lot. However, once you're finished at Keukenhof, you can rent a bike just inside the gate and bike around the bulb fields which surround Keukenhof. And this is definitely the best way to see how tulips are grown and harvested, besides it being perfectly flat. Now, this is my friend Jean, with whom I have seen many gardens in various countries, including some right here in South Africa. Biking around the bulb fields in 2012, we stopped for a closer look after the vistas of Keukenhof. What is so amazing about seeing the bulb fields close up is you began to realize how tulips are cultivated, harvested, and marketed. These blooms are not about to be cut stems sent to market. Not at all. Something much more sinister awaits. In fact, all these blooms are about to be murdered and their pretty little heads cut off. Why? Because the tulip bulb has to mature to a certain size. And if the flower is left to go to seed, then the bulb is weakened. This allows the remaining plant to direct its energy back into the bulb and not the flower, where the seed matures, and it stimulates the growth to produce top-size bulbs. Top-size bulbs are grown and allowed to flower for at least several years, but at the height of their beauty, all of the flower heads are chopped off, and we just happen to be there on that day. And there is a very interesting agricultural machine that does this. What happens is that this machine goes up several rows at a time and cuts the blooms off the top of the stem, leaving a mass of colored petals in between the rows, which you can see here. You can see the pink leaves that have been chopped off. The vibrant red strip is next. You can see how lush and full these pink blooms are. And like a threshing machine, this contraption severs their heads, just at their peak. But, and here's the interesting part, there are always rogue blooms that the machine does not reach. So these blossoms must be pulled off by hand. On the back of this contraption are 2 long arms with up to 3 children lying down on each of the arms, grabbing the blossoms that the machine misses as it goes up each row. Now, adults would be too big for this job. We were told that these were seasonal workers, probably from Bulgaria, Romania, or Poland. Talk about health and safety. Jean and I were gobsmacked. Now, these are not orange tulips. And by the way, orange is, as you know, very big in Holland. These are people celebrating Queen's Day, as it was in 2012 in Amsterdam, when Jean and I just happened to be invited to the party. Over 2 million people flood the streets and canals of Amsterdam, and the raucous festivities were a celebration of Queen Beatrix's birthday, which was on the 30th of April that year. Well, in every year. Queen Beatrix, however, chose 2013, the year after our visit, the next year's Queen's Day, to abdicate her throne to her son, Willem-Alexander, following a Dutch tradition of handing over the monarchy to a new generation instead of dying with the crown, unlike the British throne. Queen's Day was started in 1885, but is now called King's Day because of Willem-Alexander, and his birthday is on the 27th of April, which means if you visit Holland to see the tulips, you might also want to be there for this riotous, colorful, peaceful, friendly, and jam-packed party. Besides being a 24-hour party, Queen's Day, King's Day is also Free Market Day. Apparently, this is the only day of the year in the Netherlands when rummage sales are allowed, and the Dutch take this opportunity to throw a nationwide yard sale with household items they no longer want or need. But the real action is on the canals, which are thronged with boats. These are my photographs. At this point, I had an iPhone. Each boat had its own sound system, blaring music, with tribes of young people dancing, singing, and waving. And the boats just kept coming. Everyone is drinking beer, wearing orange, and having a ball. I honestly have never been in the midst of such a huge and happy throng. Besides wearing orange, many people, particularly on the boats cruising the canals, were in costumes, sort of like the rugby sevens. Here we have the naval officers. There were people 10 deep in the streets, but everyone was happy and helpful. I cannot recommend King's Day enough. My love affair with the tulips started when I realized I could have my own spring flower show every year. And in my Zoom tour of French gardens, I included some pictures of my house in England with tulips, and here's another one. What also helped to keep my addiction alive was a local garden just down the road, which I could visit each spring for inspiration. It's called Cheyne's Manor. And Cheyne's Manor is one of the UK's finest Tudor mansion houses. Dendrochronological evidence, which is the dating of timbers from the building, suggests that it was constructed in 1537 and 8. The Grade 1 listed building set in Buckinghamshire's charming estate village of Cheyne's is an easy 30-minute train ride from London Marylebone and about 10 minutes from my former house in Chalfont-St. Giles. Elizabeth I visited Cheyne's Manor several times, including as an infant princess with her mother Anne Boleyn and father Henry VIII. They would have been accommodated in a grander wing now where the barns stand. This was the home of the Dukes of Bedford until the 20th century, when it was bought in 1956 by Colonel and Mrs. MacLeod Matthews. And it is now the family home of their son and his wife, who open it to the public a few times a year. From the end of April to the beginning of May, Cheyne's Manor was a show garden for 6,000 tulips, all ordered from Blom's Bulbs, one of the largest Dutch bulb suppliers. Colonel and Mrs. McLeod Matthews must have been in their 70s when I first started going each spring. And Mrs. McLeod Matthews was a proper, posh English lady who wore muddy rubber boots, an old hat, and looked like the help. She had an army of devoted volunteers, and the tea they served was scrumptious, all homemade lemon drizzle cake this, and meringue and strawberry tart that. It was a fabulous day out in May. The bulbs were changed every year, and a new combination of color and underplanting was tried. Just look how effective and simple this pairing is of white tulips with blue forget-me-nots. Or this one with wallflowers. Sadly, Colonel McLeod Matthews died in 2001 and his wife Elizabeth in 2016, the year after we moved to South Africa. Charles, the son, and his wife Boo continue to open the house to the public and make it available for filming, events, and weddings. But it's the gardens that perhaps remain the chief attraction of Cheney's Manor, setting off the rambling Tudor buildings to perfection, which you can also tour when you visit. Then when the tulips are over, all the bulbs are dug up in June and given to the volunteers as new bulbs are ordered. Cheney's summer garden, resplendent with dahlias and roses, is also worth seeing, but it is the tulips that are really the most famous. Blom's, the supplier of bulbs to Cheney's Manor, has been the winner of 68 gold medals at the RHS Chelsea Flower Show in London. Blom's has been in business since 1860, and they are still family owned and operated 5 generations on. This is what the Blom's display looks like at the Chelsea Flower Show in the Grand Marquis. Masses and masses, all different colors, all different types, and all perfect. In 1949, the year I was born, 3rd generation Walter Blom, the grandfather of this chap, became one of the 9 founders of the Keukenhof Gardens. Together, they persuaded another 11 prominent Dutch bulb growers to come up with a plan to establish these now famous gardens, which were intended to showcase their new bulb varieties as well as existing blooms. The very next year, 1950, Keukenhof Gardens opened to 236 visitors. Now, where do you think he got that jacket? Wouldn't that have been perfect today? So, my friends, we are almost at the end of our tulip journey. And for me, this has been a revelation of some of my previous trips, photos, and treasured moments, as well as a learning process. I used to anguish over choosing tulips each year for planting in pots. The colors were so seductive, the shape so enticing. I particularly loved the fringed and lily-shaped ones. Have you ever thought about what kind of flower you would be if you were a flower? Well, I'm pretty sure that I would be a tulip. But oh, which variety? This might help you decide. Would you be an elegant lady, exotic bird, Eskimo chief, dragon king, flaming prominence? I might be flaming prominence. Abbey Road or African queen, burning love, Dolce Vita, orange monarch or royal pretender, Attila or blushing girl, dark star, double price, red devil, or parrot lady. There are so many to choose from. It's a very tough choice. I couldn't possibly say. I'd like to thank you all, near and far, for joining me not only on this tulip journey, but on my other 3 Zoom garden adventures. I would also like to thank Amanda Osorio for her unfailing, outstanding, and enthusiastic assistance, as well as my husband, Jeff, who is the technical wizard behind the scenes. It's been a very great pleasure and a privilege to travel with you to so many colorful kingdoms. Here's hoping that in the future, my next garden tour will be a real one right here in Cape Town. Thank you. Are we all on?
That was wonderful. Thank you, Margie.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Just
Great.
gorgeous.
Excuse me. T20 cricket is back. CPL live from 4 p.m. Cricket bat and
Cricket, an English tradition I never embraced.
Thank you, Margaret. That was
Stunning, Margaret.
Just
Stunning.
wonderful.
Thank you very
Mira,
much.
Mira, have you ever been to Cheney's?
Yes, I have been to
There we go.
Chinese and I've been to Coconut too.
Oh, great. And
Yes.
Mal, I know we've been to Cheney's together, haven't we?
Well, I don't remember, but if you say so.
Love your turban. I love your turban.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure how to dress for the occasion, but you know.
I always dress appropriately.
Like a sultan, a sultana.
Yeah.
I tell you, you wouldn't want to have been one of those women at the harems. They didn't go very far.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. See you soon, I hope, in real life.
Yes.
Thank you, Margaret.
Can't
Amazing.
wait.
Next one, Margaret.
Thank you
What's
so
the
much.
next-
Okay.
That
What's
was
the next
just
one about,
gorgeous.
Yeah.
I don't have any plans for a next one.
Oh, yes, you do. Oh,
Yes,
yes, you do.
I'm thinking about it.
Inspiration has to strike, and I haven't really thought of what I would do next. Plus, now that the lockdown is on level 2, we can travel a bit more, which my husband and I are planning to do. So
Yeah.
I'm going to hang up my Zoom boots for a little while.
Margie,
Oh,
please do
same.
Italian gardens.
We'll see. We'll see.
Roses. I
Yes.
love roses. I'd love to
Yeah.
learn about roses.
Roses
Oh,
would
yes.
be a good one. Yeah,
That's a
roses
good
and the
idea.
famous women who love them.
Yeah.
Josephine. Okay, well,
Great one.
Like
I'll be
diamonds.
thinking. I'll be thinking. But thank you, everyone. Happy day.
Thank you, Margie. Good to see you all.
Travel safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Just divine to see you all.